Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoyed the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. My guest this week is the incredibly impressive and entrepreneurial Tabi Haller-Jorden. She's got a fabulous CV. She's currently the president and the chief executive of the Paradigm Forum GmbH, which is a global consultancy and a think tank. She's worked in a wide range of other roles. She was the Senior Vice President of Global Learning Strategies at Catalyst. She's worked at JP Morgan. She's worked at HNC Consulting. She's an executive director at has been an executive director at the Learning Labs. And she's the founder of the Public Policy Center in Philadelphia. She's on numerous boards. She has a huge remit in terms of the stuff she covers, and she's got some amazing experiences in terms of leadership. She loves being a leader and has been in leadership roles much of her career, and she'll talk a lot about that. And she's got some fabulous tips that I think you will really resonate with. We've worked together at Deloitte University, where she also does quite a bit of work and supports various courses there. And every time I know that when I've worked with her, she engages the participants enormously. And so I'm hoping you'll find this absolutely fascinating. And without further ado, off we go. Tabi, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's great to have you. I've obviously worked with you a few times at Deloitte University, and I know it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Really looking forward to talking to you.
Oh, and thank you, Bob, for the invitation. I always enjoy answering questions, right? It allows me to think more deeply about why I do what I do, and looking forward to our discussion.
No, that's great. And to get us started then, I mean, you have got currently, never mind in the past, you have a very multifaceted portfolio career. You've had an amazing career journey. I think, could you just give a bit of a summary of that journey and where you've got to so far? That would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a challenge to summarize it coherently, but I've had the benefit and privilege of working across a spectrum of industries. So I started my career on Wall Street and then transitioned into the nonprofit, the research, NGO world, subsequently worked with national governments in an advisory capacity. I've now done significant work with the academic sector, primarily because, as I think about the future prospects for our younger generations, we're facing a lot of challenging issues. And I do believe that we need to make a more concerted effort to partner with academic institutions to help them navigate what appears to be just inordinate complexity about, what will the workplace look like? How can we better ensure that our students are future ready? What does that mean? What does it entail? And so on. So there's been a nice convergence, if you will, with all the advisory and research work that I've done now in the context too of working with academic institutions as yet another kind of avenue to apply some of the research that we've conducted.
No, that's great. I mean, I think you have, I'm sure we'll come onto it as we go through, a whole range of different board positions and a lot of senior leadership roles, which this podcast is all about leadership. So drilling into that a little bit to get some of your kind of leadership development tips, I think will be immensely valuable. But before we do that, can we go right back to the beginning? Sort of early motivations for you, growing up, what were your early motivations? How did you get started? What took you into the field you went into Wall Street initially, that sort of thing?
Yes. Well, my parents were in both public service, academics, and I would say, both of them had, in my mind, quite an entrepreneurial bent to how they looked at the world. And that was very, very influential in my upbringing in terms of trying to think about, if you see a problem or you see a challenge, don't simply receive it and accept it. See if there's anything you can do to better kind of either improve things or engage in challenges that kind of bring meaning. So I early on, I really did have an appetite for social advocacy and change. And obviously, in many circumstances, when you have that kind of commitment, it requires you to take some form of leadership, right? You need to be able to either rally a cause, rally other individuals behind you, and so forth. So that was very instrumental. I did tend to be really interested in taking on leadership positions when I was a student. I just saw I was kind of endlessly pursuing opportunities to make things a little bit better if I, had that opportunity, and was kind of bitten by that bug quite early on. So that seems to be kind of a red thread in my career is rather than passively accepting a set of circumstances or conditions, seeing if there's something that I can do to enhance or improve a set of circumstances. So I think that is kind of was very much kind of a key motivation in my assumption of different leadership roles, less about kind of positional authority and more the opportunity to develop the necessary relationships and develop the influencing skills, right, that are necessary to rally people around a cause.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially because fairly early on in your career, I mean, we've moved into a world which is rather better now around diversity and acceptance of the need for better diversity and so on. But I'm guessing at the beginning of your career that was a bit more of a challenge, wasn't it? Did you find that quite hard trying to step into leadership roles as a lady earlier on?
That's an interesting question because, kind of an interesting personal dimension of my background. My name is actually Japanese. Tabibito means traveler, and I spent a number of years in Japan. My mother was a Japanese linguist, so we were introduced to a lot of different cultures. I traveled to 6 or 7 countries as a child, et cetera. So that facility with cultural difference really was tied to my insatiable curiosity about, wow, that's interesting. That's very different, as opposed to trying to pass judgment. I don't like that or that doesn't work. So I think that was also an aspect of my background and upbringing that allowed me to be reasonably comfortable in situations that I wasn't familiar with. I've often said to people, one of the best preparations to be a leader is to know firsthand the experience of being profoundly incompetent. And that's something that you are exposed to when you're thrown into a culture that has a completely different way of working, looking at the world, and so forth. So you learn very quickly that the kind of a perspective of maybe is actually very relevant because maybe you understand what's going on, maybe you don't. And I think, bringing in a healthy dose of humility into your cultural encounter. So that made me both very compelled and intrigued by the diversity challenge, which is a real challenge, right? Because I don't think people understand the degree to which even the nuance of how you frame a question or how you choose to engage with someone is a cultural act. So I think we tend to think that there's a universality in terms of how we engage with people and how we motivate them and so on. So there really was a very critical component to being comfortable not only working with difference, but enjoying it and then, realizing that this is actually not a problem, but an opportunity. And so I was very privileged to have had that background so that I wasn't overwhelmed or turned into roadkill, right, by the by the enormity of the diversity and the levels and dimensions of that diversity that we're confronted with.
Turned into roadkill. Oh, that one will live with me. I think that's great. I think, yeah, I mean, credit to you because it definitely cannot have been easy early doors to break down some of those barriers. I think I mean, I just look back at my own career in the military and to some extent with a bit of horror really as to some of the things we did, said, had as policies, never mind actually, just the behaviors and so on, were quite extraordinary. And when you look at it through today's lens, you'd think, how on earth did we, exist in that kind of position? So it's really great that it's moved in the right direction. I mean, clearly it's still a journey and and there's more to do and ever more to keep an eye on to make sure we don't revert in any way. But no, that's really, really interesting.
Just to build on that comment, Bob, because it's very, very interesting. I often tell people that when you're confronted by a situation that you're not familiar with. What you have to be very, very careful is not to revert to being a judger, but to being a learner. And it's a very different mindset. And unfortunately, our workplaces really reward judgment. And there are obviously a number of circumstances where being able to discern and judge effectively and accurately is critically important. But I'm often concerned by that initial disposition to judge as opposed to, tell me more. Can you give me an example of that? Seek to learn and to understand rather than to judge. So, sometimes I see that tension and often advise people just be very careful. Stay curious as long as you can, because the opportunity to learn from someone by its very nature builds a bridge that's invaluable to building that kind of rapport.
No, it's a terrific point. And actually, the judgment thing, just to digress for a second, I mean, I often talk to people I'm training with and so on as well about be very conscious, particularly youngsters who have the view these days, I think a lot of the time, and I don't think I was any different when I was young, that, I can do what I want, say what I want, I am, and, so on. And that's being driven more by bring your authentic self to work and all those sorts of things. And so that's great, but you've got to recognize that we do live in a judgmental world a lot of the time, and people will judge you for whatever they see, whatever they hear, maybe even before you've said anything, they're going to be making judgments about you. So the way you dress, the way you behave, the way you speak, all of that stuff matters. And it's really important that you control that in terms of your personal brand development, that actually you're shaping that in a way that you want to be kind of judged, as opposed to the way people might just do it for you.
Yes. And I think that's also related to very interesting issue, right? When we learn about kind of how we believe we should be effective in certain circumstances, it's a very cognitive, by and large, cognitive declaration as opposed to an emotive one. And, the problem is when we're under stress, which is quite often, it does not necessarily, we don't revert to that kind of practiced understanding of what it means to kind of stay in the moment. We're not necessarily very good at being present, ironically enough, which is kind of a foundational skill to deep listening and so forth. So we're already anticipating and strategizing about how we're going to navigate a complex situation instead of kind of being present and observing what's going on and trying to give ourselves some time for some reflection, right? It's quite interesting. I remember early in my career I was asked to sit on a panel, and I did not feel that I was adequately prepared to be on that panel simply because the depth and breadth of my expertise in that area. And I had a wonderful manager at Morgan who said, Tabi, let me teach you a technique, or let me share a technique that has worked for me when I'm presented with questions around which I have no information or no background. He said, if somebody asks you a question and you don't feel comfortable answering it, say, that's a fascinating question, but I think the real question we need to address is. And so he taught me the art of pivot, and I do think sometimes we're so compelled to answer that we don't actually allow ourselves to think, let me think about that, or I've never thought about that. Can you give me an example? Again, it's that real the significance of staying in the moment as much as you can, rather than precipitously jumping in with what you think is the answer or the solution. So some of these skills are very foundational, and yet I sometimes think we forget the basics in terms of staying present, which I think is an incredibly important skill and mindset.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think particularly as a leader, the more senior you are as a leader in many ways, the more important it is that you actually listen first, talk later. It's just so unhelpful. I mean, particularly in relatively hierarchical organizations, so like the military, where regularly you could walk into a room and if you opined about a particular issue and you said, right, this is what I think we're going to do, then of course you would, and then, right, what do you think? And the answer is, well, they're all going to agree with you if you're not careful. You're not going to get any pushback. You're not going to get any better ideas, because actually people are just going to sit there and think, well, no, that's what he wants to do. That's what we'll do, which is unhelpful. And it's not necessarily what you meant, but you can kind of commit thought crime in, as a leader in some of the way, you act if you're not careful here, I think, which is an important thing to remember.
Yeah, I remember a CEO telling me, Tabby, I'm so frustrated. I'm completely surrounded by yes people, and I'm not getting any pushback. And I said, well, why don't you let people know in the next meeting with your top team that no one is allowed to leave the room until they disagree with you about some point? And he said, well, that's an interesting strategy. And he said, Tabby, it kind of opened up the synapses a bit because people realized, okay, I need to be a little bit more critical. And, he said, I just don't want gratuitous disagreement, but really listen to what I'm proposing or what we need to discuss, because truthfully, there is a real danger that we may overstep or underestimate. So I want a lot of good contingent thinking. I thought that the technique was kind of came from just a mild sense of good humor. But he said it actually did work because I just said, you can't leave the room until I hear some evidence of or a question that you think I haven't adequately addressed or considered. So again, I'm a big fan of sometimes it's these little techniques that can wake us up a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I think the personality types thing is important in there as well, because I think introverts versus extroverts. If you're an extrovert leader, which of course a lot of leaders are relatively extrovert, or at least they put on that persona to to be in their leadership mode, even if they're quite introverted in genuine style. But actually, the introverts who need more time to process, more time to think about what they're actually going to do, giving them that time and allowing them the opportunity to then come back with something a bit more considered is really important. So being too quick to move through the agenda and get to the next point, you might miss stuff that actually is really valuable to you as well.
And I'd love to build on that point, Bob, because you made a point earlier about diversity that is a very important, I think, consideration and success factor in working effectively with diversity is you have a responsibility, I think, as a leader to create the enabling conditions that will allow, for example, an introvert to feel comfortable jumping in. And so, one technique that I think can be very helpful is for a leader to say, here's my position on this issue, but here are some additional questions that I continue to mull over because I'm not convinced that we either have enough data to suggest one point of direction versus another. And here are the questions I'm grappling with, right? So that to me makes it you're creating kind of a friendly environment for other people that have other questions. So you need to do an effective job of preemptively mirroring the behavior that you'd like to invite other people to consider. So I think, we tend to gravitate to our own comfort level in terms of our style, communication style, et cetera. But I think part of the responsibility of being an effective leader is to kind of open up the possibility of engaging with people that are quite different from you and what is it that I can do to make people with a different persona, a different mindset feel more comfortable contributing. So I think there's a level of consciousness to that I think is extremely important.
No, that's a great point, and it's actually also a great segue into the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, because I mean, leadership style, in broad terms, rather than going and drilling into traits and so on, which we might do in a minute. And just as you've gone through your career, and as we said, very multifaceted, very diverse kind of career, how have you kind of consciously or unconsciously changed your leadership style as you've grown through your different roles? What's different about you now to the way you were, at the beginning?
Very interesting question. And it brings me back to graduate school when I was doing work. I did a lot of work in organizational psychology, labor law, industrial relations, et cetera. And I remember the professor asked us, there are about, at the time, maybe 15 very current kind of theories of leadership. And he said, I'd like you to select one of those that you think are most relevant, given your, ability to discern the types of complexities that you may be facing as a leader, et cetera. And I found it quite easy to make the selection that I did, and that was situational leadership, because I thought, it can't be formulaic. So the responsibility is, how am I reading this situation? And what does this situation or this issue or this challenge require of me to not only be effective, but to be relevant given the contextual situation? So I have often found that to be very, very helpful. So when I'm in a situation, going back to my point about being present, I really spend some time kind of sussing out what is going on here. And one of the strategies I often use as a leader is not getting distracted by the symptoms, but going back or down into the root causes. Because too often it's kind of, an elaborate game of whack-a-mole where we're saying, this symptom, how are we going to deal with this, et cetera, et cetera. So I have found the whole notion of situational leadership to be really important because it humbles you in the face of a very complex situation. It's not about you per se, but it's about how you partner with those challenges in a way that will ensure that you're kind of honoring that complexity, but really doing a reasonably good job of discerning what is required of you and others to navigate those waters. So I would say I'm kind of both a situational and a reflective leader. I feel very strongly about, the importance of critical reflection, asking really good questions. Why is that? Getting down to the bedrock of what has precipitated a particular challenge or issue. So that would be kind of a quick overview, but I'm really interested in that because it also goes back to the diversity issue. A lot that is really significant in a challenge is not necessarily immediately revealed. You have to kind of do some exploration yourself. So that would be my response to that.
No, terrific. Yeah, that's a great point, and I think just thinking of it like I hadn't really thought about it like that, but as that gives me pause for thought as well. So that's really useful. I mean, stick with that sort of general leadership theme. Traits. You've mentioned humility as being really important. I completely agree. I mean, I think it's a fundamentally important skill to have. Other things that you think are particularly important, but both for yourself, but also that you look for in
Yeah.
other people.
I think what I call kind of provisional competency, right? And what I mean by that is, we come to any situation with our history, our experiences, our training, et cetera, et cetera. But we're typically in situations where there could be, going back to my point about being a learner versus a judger, there may be things that others can contribute. So, I do believe in the we of leadership, right? Rather than just the I of leadership. I think we need to bring as much clarity and integrity and honesty as we can. But I also think we need to bring an appetite to be changed, right? To learn, et cetera. So I think I'm a big fan of collaborative leadership because I don't think there's enough. I think our future lies in collaboration. It doesn't necessarily lie, I think, in the I. So our ability to make, again, to be very invitational, to create those enabling circumstances. I've had the privilege of working with amazing teams, and I often ask myself, I remember actually early on in my career, someone I was working with who was very senior, this particular company said, Tabby, how should I engage with you to bring out the best in you? And I thought that was a great question, right? Because had much less to do with whatever he thought he might bring or his own style, but what are the facets of how I like to work? So I told him, for example, if you tell me X needs to be done in 3 months, that's more than enough. You don't need to check in with me every day and make sure I'm on track and so on. And so I think and I think over the course of our career, we become more cognizant of how we work, and we also become more cognizant of our own blind spots, right? And so we need to really be attentive to not, hubris can be a nasty thing, right? Because we kind of want to be able to insulate ourselves, but there's a degree of being a good leader that I think entails being a willingness to be vulnerable to either pushback or a different point of view, or so on. One of my favorite questions that I ask in my team meetings is what could we be missing? It's a really important question, right? I mean,
For
we
sure.
tend
Yeah.
to focus on, getting prepared, and that's obviously incredibly important, but the best laid plans, right? We need to kind of think contingently. So that's kind of a whole host, but I think leadership is really a fascinating issue in that I think traditionally we've thought of it as a skill set, but I also think it's a mindset. And I think we need to really continue to kind of hone our craft, right? And continue to really develop new skills, new approaches. I think the whole notion of being a lifelong learner is vitally important because, increasingly the shelf life of knowledge is about 10 minutes. So, we need to ensure that, we're as much as we can be at the edge of our game. But, that's by virtue of what we're willing to learn, the company we keep, the questions we ask. These are all really, really important considerations.
No, again, lots of super points in there. I'll pick up a couple of them actually, because I definitely agree about the lifelong learner thing. I mean, I tend to say to people, look, leadership is a journey you're never going to complete.
Right.
If you think you've finished, then you probably need to look hard in the mirror, because the reality is you should always be looking to learn, always be looking to develop, no matter what you've done, no matter how senior you are. But the other thing that amused me when you said, if you need something's going to be done in 3 months, don't keep reminding me. One of my weaknesses personally is if somebody says to me, "Oh, you've got 3 months to do it," I'll probably do it at 2 months and 2 weeks. I'll start doing it, as opposed to if I know I've got to, because I like the pressure. I actually enjoy being, right, now I've got a deadline to hit now. I've got to work, which is, so I kind of know in myself that I don't need those kind of very long deadlines, because the stuff goes into the pending tray and appears when it ultimately has to be done. Which, of course, for some people, they didn't mean 3 months. They meant that actually they really wanted it done pretty soon. But but they're just saying that to you. But the other point you made, I think, was really interesting in terms of getting the best out of you as an individual. One of the things that it post-dates my own time at Deloitte, but I know that in Deloitte UK now, they tend to do this thing where they talk about a manual of me, which I think is a really good concept, where you're basically literally writing down, this is the sort of stuff that I know is my best work practice, and these are the things I kind of need to be the best I can be, and these are the areas where I'm perhaps a bit more challenged, and so on and so forth. Which actually, if you're honest with yourself in terms of producing that, I think it's a really, really good idea, because it can be very helpful to to teams and to team leaders to know how they're going to get the best out of the people they've got there.
No, I think it's actually a brilliant tool because again, it builds on the whole issue of learning, not judging. So it's not let's say you indicate that you're a morning person and the best quality work you do is in the morning. That's neither good nor bad, but it's a reality that will bring out the sense of engagement, the level of motivation, the morale. So, these seemingly small differences can be very significant in their impact, right? And I also think that it's a sign of respect as well to know, what is it that I can do to bring out the best in others and so on. So I do think it's a brilliant tool to actually, take that reflection time and say, if I thought about myself and how I work and how I prefer to work and when I feel my, high energy levels, good motivation, morale, what are the ingredients? And I think, again, I think it's a fantastic thing because it invites a level of personal self-awareness, which is also very important, right? We spend a lot of time kind of assessing the environment, but I think we need to really come to terms with, okay, what's the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? About what I bring to a situation. And I think that's extremely important.
No, I tend to think as well that actually you need people in your life who are prepared to tell you when you're actually not doing things that are optimal for the team, etc. Because and actually create back to your creating the conditions for that. I think that's really important that you kind of allow a world where people can come and challenge you, and you're making it quite clear that even under difficult circumstances, you can do that. I did an interview a while back with a chap called John Caudle, who's an ex-US Navy captain. And he had a wonderful story, which I really, really resonated with me, where he said when he was young, his dad had been quite a disciplinarian on him and was pretty strict. But when he was out in public, obviously he didn't want to do anything that was going to attract any kind of public gaze about anything he was doing to his son. But the code for "you're about to get a clip round the ear" was, "Do you want a peanut butter sandwich?" And he had then taken that forward into his Navy time, where when he was commanding ships, he would say to his XO, his immediate deputy, if you think I'm basically out of order here and you need to talk to me and say that, look, Captain, you want to think about that a bit differently, don't call me out in public. Just come up to me and say, "Hey, Captain, you want a peanut butter sandwich?" And I thought it was terrific, as a way of giving him permission to open up that kind of challenge to do that, because in those kind of environments, certainly it's not appropriate to challenge the leader's decision openly, publicly, in a way that then looks sort of undermines him or her. So I think the having those kind of little tips is quite healthy.
Wonderful. And the other, the point you're also raising is, typically feedback is just a very sensitive, complicated issue. But I think having kind of a code language, it reminds me of a client that I had a few years ago who's Dutch. And she was getting a lot of negative feedback from her colleagues that she was really rough at the edges, very, kind of brittle, direct, etc. And she said, Tabby, it's also a cultural thing. And, there's just no way I can change my personality. And I said, well, here's a strategy. Given that you are Dutch, and you want to let people know that what you're about to say may come across as being harsh, but that's not your intention. Say, as you're about to have a conversation, I'm about to speak Dutch. And that will alert them, okay, what's coming? It may sound trite, but I love these techniques. And if we as leaders and managers and so on can come up with kind of a code word, etc., it just brings more humanity into the workplace. And I think it also, in and of itself, makes us more human. And also inevitably adds a level of humor and so on. So I think to think about that, right, as a team building opportunity, what is it I could say? Because I know sometimes, again, going back to my point about stress does not bring out generally the best in people. And yet sometimes the reality is, a situation is very stressful. So how do we circumvent, the inevitability of the rough edges in certain circumstances and yet still keep our authenticity? And I think to come up either with a code word or a phrase. And what was so interesting about her example is that everyone else on her team adopted that too, even though they weren't Dutch. So when they were getting frustrated and so on,
That's
they said,
brilliant.
"How to speak Dutch." So again, I think it's an interesting challenge and opportunity to be a little creative and come up with some good code words or phrases or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really good. I like to talk about role models. You already mentioned a couple of people you've talked about, but particularly your boss at JP Morgan, and the whole kind of coming back with a challenge to a question you couldn't answer thing. Other role models? I mean, who has really helped you
Yes.
and shaped you?
Oh, definitely. Well, first of all, my mother was just incredible because she was a real maverick and leader in her own right. Not many people were getting their PhDs in Japanese linguistics in 1945.
Wow.
And so she opened up, the Japanese culture essentially to the West. She was decorated by the Japanese emperor. She just was an amazing woman who was very, very culturally attuned. So, she was very adept as a child. If I asked a question, for her to say, and why is that question important to you, right? And it wasn't, and I remember even some of her research projects she had us involved in, which was very interesting about how just the sound, the configuration of consonants makes us think of something either positive or negative. So she was really just a thoughtful, deep thinker who was remarkably adept at asking questions that provoke deeper thinking. And I really tried to kind of develop that. She was also an incredible storyteller. To watch her give a speech was just, I mean, people were riveted because she had this wonderful array of stories. So she had this incredible linguistic sophistication, but she brought it to an accessible level with stories. And I feel like I've tried to adopt that. I always collect stories or incidents, that I will recall. And it's one of the reasons why I think storytelling is kind of, and I think it's beginning to become much more, I think, to be recognized as a critical leadership skill and talent. But it's such an incredible technique for engagement, for thoughtfulness. for energy, for morale, and so on. So she was really instrumental in her wisdom, how she was incredibly adept at interacting with people and making them feel comfortable. So I really, as a child, was just watching her, right, in action. But the storytelling, I think I really adopted. It's just a really important strategy and approach that I feel very comfortable with, and I think that comfort is very much, I can attribute that to her, her leadership. I would also say I was just really gifted with a lot of incredible teachers over the course of my career who really just kind of pushed me and asked me great questions. I was a very kind of avid learner, and they just kept on taking me to the edge, taking me to the edge, and with so much grace and so much humor and so much kindness. So I would say that a lot of the mentors I had really were character mentors for me. It wasn't necessarily content expertise, it was how they treated people, the values that they embodied, how they showed respect, how they made other people comfortable. And these are very difficult to teach, right? It's really so helpful to see these character traits embodied. And, kindness, for example. I had a number of people that are so incredibly kind and incredibly competent at the same thing. I think we tend to have kind of a zero-sum mentality around certain types of skills. We think, okay, if you're, really good leader and you're decisive and clear, you're not necessarily looking at those soft skills. And I have, over the course of my career, done an absolute flip with those. I actually think the soft skills are the hard skills. Those are much more of a rarity. And I remember a client saying to me, Tabby, we hire attitudes, we train skills.
Yeah,
And
that's a great point. I've never heard it put that way, but that's a really good point.
and their argument was it was a heck of a lot more difficult to find those deeper character traits than it was technical knowledge. And I think as we see, AI moving in and kind of taking residence in our workplaces, in our homes, in our mindsets, I think these human skills are going to become even more significant as differentiators. And I do think people want to be inspired, right? I think that old adage, people don't leave a company, they leave their manager, has everything to do with these character traits. You know, I've never heard anyone say, I'm leaving because, my manager didn't know how to do a differential equation, right? I mean, I don't think it's going to happen. But, how we're treated, how we're respected. So that would be perhaps, a core attribute of all the people I've been privileged to be mentored by is how they treat people.
No, that's a great, again, another great point. And I think so true in terms of the importance of soft skills. And sadly, what I see a lot of the time is that's one of the areas that a lot of organizations are very poor at developing.
Yes.
Because they will focus on, completely understandably from a commercial point of view, they'll focus on the business end of what they're doing. So they want people to be better salespeople or better marketeers or whatever it happens to be, and and that's what they're going to focus on. That's what they're going to assess them on. Potentially pay them, pay them, salary and bonuses and promotions on, and all this stuff that actually makes you a better leader is too often by osmosis rather than actually anyone turning around and putting any real effort into thinking about how can we help you with that in terms of developing some of those skills. And I think just like you, I have over the years, I've adapted my own style a lot based on what I've seen, good, bad, and ugly, from people that I've worked with, mistakes I've made myself, things I've done well myself, people that I've loved working with, people that I've hated working with. So all of that, makes a kind of, I talk about metaphorically two jars. I have a jar of stuff I love and a jar of stuff I don't like. And I, try and obviously have this one fuller than this one. But at the same time, you never quite know how that's going to work out some of the time as well. Your mum, I mean, hats off to your mum, especially, you mentioned doing that in Japan in 1945. I mean, that must have been in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, with everything that had gone on then, and the kind of, the Japanese having been defeated, the atomic bomb, and that must have been an incredible time to be working out there for her. Extraordinary.
No, no, it really was. And to build on your other the point that you just made, because I think it's a really significant point, Bob, is I think we often confuse means and ends. So what I mean by that is, going to your point about teaching people how to sell or marketing, et cetera. There is absolutely no way that you can do that effectively without those soft skills, right? So in other words, I sometimes see technical skills as being the proverbial hygiene factors. They're necessary but not sufficient. They're at the bottom of Maslow's triangle. You've got to get up into the personal connection because everyone will have those technical skills. So I think what we often forget is that the objective or the end state requires a set of skills and the means to get to that end, right? You can't kind of leapfrog over those skills and say, okay, here's your sales quota, et cetera, without really developing a capacity to really do what does it mean to develop a rapport with people, right? And I think my concern around social media and so on is that we've become preoccupied with efficiency. And we don't know how to be bored. We don't know how to kind of reflect. We're losing some vital virtues and values that I think if we begin to compromise those, we will in fact become more robotic, right? And humanizing element that really is differentiating. And I sometimes become very discouraged by this focus on efficiency, not recognizing that that comes at a very significant human cost. And, I do think robotic intelligence is very quickly overcoming us, right? Overcoming our capacities in a number of different ways. But I just don't believe that we're going to really have the impact going forward unless we are capable of enacting and enabling those more humanistic values and virtues.
No, I totally agree. I think social media for one, smartphones just generally, actually, the amount of times I was talking about it very recently on another podcast that the amount of people you see, even couples in restaurants sat there and they're both on their phones, or someone was telling me the other day, a lot of youngsters these days, if you ring them up, they won't answer the phone, but then they'll text you back going, "What did you want?" And they, you go, "Oh, come on." This is the kind of communication and social interaction is a basic human, not only skill, it's a need. And and I think we are at risk of losing some of that, and we need to adapt and shape that. And I think leaders have a role in doing that for sure.
Definitely, definitely, absolutely.
If you go all the way back to the beginning, and knowing what you know now at the stage you're at in your career, what advice would you be offering to young Tabi now? Would you take the same course? Would you do that stuff differently?
Yeah, I probably would take the same course, but I'd often share this. I was listening, I was attending virtually a conference, and it was about, how do we kind of address and face all the complexities of change that are required now, et cetera, et cetera. And someone in the audience asked one of the speakers, I understand institutionally what you're attempting to do, but do you have any insights or recommendations in terms of how you have gone about challenging yourself to stay at the edge of your game? And the speaker said, that's a brilliant question. And actually, the answer that I have is on the post-it on my laptop. And the question that I have on top of my laptop is, what's the bolder version of this decision? Not that I will necessarily take that bolder version, but I should always consider that bolder version. Now, I started being kind of bold, probably semi-obnoxious quite early, right? Because I'll give you an example. I was in high school, and at that time, I was extremely interested in, and I did subsequently study architecture, but I wanted to go into architectural restoration, historic preservation, and so on. And there was a fantastic course being offered at Cornell in their summer program. And, they described exactly what I wanted to do. And the last line said, graduate students only. And I thought, okay, that's a little bit of a problem because I'm a high school student. But I thought, what the heck? So I called the professor and I said, I'm incredibly interested in your course and I've taken some courses on the side and, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, oh, you just sound like the perfect student. You should sign up. And I said, well, there's a small glitch. And he said, what is that? And I said, well, I'm a high school student. I'm not a graduate student. There was a pause at the other end of the phone. He said, listen, it's been a long time since I heard this level of enthusiasm, so I'm going to make an exception. So I had a number of those incidents over the course of my life where, I mean, obviously that was the guideline, but I thought, what's the worst that can happen? He said, listen, can't you read? It's graduate students only. And I would say, sorry for, wasting your time, et cetera, et cetera. And you go on. But I guess my advice to myself and advice to others who might be listening to this podcast is, don't allow yourself to leave things unexplored if there is something compelling and interesting. Because, as I said, I remember reading too a piece a couple of years ago that a woman was doing interesting research on people's legacies and so on. And the question that she was asked is, is there any consistent response that you're getting from people, let's say in their 80s, around regrets or wishes? And she said, yeah, there's one consistent thread, and that is, I wish I had been more courageous. I wish I had taken more risks. I wish I hadn't always played it safe. And I think that's really important. And I was fortunate enough to be raised in a family where that was kind of celebrated, and at least you were challenged. So I would, if I were speaking to my younger self, I'm sure there were questions and decisions that I made that were erring on the side of safety. We all do that. But I would challenge myself to, not forget to ask that question, what's the bolder version of this decision? And ask that question reasonably consistently, because it's amazing how we revert to the familiar, we revert to the comfortable, we revert to the predictable. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity just to have that niggling question, well, if you were to do something bolder with this opportunity or this set of decisions, what would that be? And just consider it. So I
No,
think
I
that,
love that. I think that's a really, yeah, it's a really great point. Interestingly, and it's not related in any way at all, but one of the things that struck me when you were saying that about challenging the status quo a little bit with your, actually this is graduate students only thing. I remember when I first joined Deloitte and I'd come out of the Air Force. I was a senior guy in the Air Force. I'd been there a long time. So I kind of had a lot of, I suppose, credibility and respect from that. But I then was very quickly thrown into a financial services engagement with one of the big banks, which I was kind of, as the partner was putting me onto that, I think he was watching the color draining from my face and then going, because I remember looking at him, I said, he's explaining what we were going to go and do. It's execution risk review. It's all C-suite and board level stuff. And I said to him, I have a bank account. That's it. I don't know anything about this stuff. And how on earth am I going to do this? And I wind the clock forward a little bit, and I actually was on the engagement. I basically got myself just about sorted out, and I was content. But I was then thinking, the bank are paying director level fees for me when actually I haven't got a clue about really what they do. But when we got into a conversation with some of the senior people in the bank, they weren't, it was completely the opposite response, which really surprised me because they went, no, 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 no. You're bringing a whole different perspective to what we do. And you're coming in with an ability to turn around and go, well, why'd you do it that way? That doesn't make any sense. And offer a level of challenge that, possibly other people who are just more in the groupthink mode wouldn't have had. So it's the same thing. And I totally agree with you. I think that kind of challenge the status quo, push the boundaries a little bit, take a bit more risk, be a bit bolder. Yeah, that's really great advice.
yeah. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me that can also be a really nice approach for people as they're trying to mentor people, is ask the people that report to you, that makes a lot of sense. What if we were to take the bolder move here? What would that be, right? Because you're inviting people's creativity, their sense of possibility, et cetera. So going back to, when you aspire or hope that you are perceived as being a mentor, a role model, and so on, I think it's to always ask the we, right? So it's not an accusatory I versus you, but if we were to do something really bold here, what would that entail? Those are the kinds of questions that excite the imagination of the people that work with us, right? And so I think that daily opportunities that, the opportunities that arise for us to stretch ourselves, stretch others, stretch collectively is something that I think is really, really important to remember.
No, perfect. I always try and talk about highs and lows, Tubby, in people's careers because inevitably they've got some. And I'd just be interested in career high for you. What's the best point?
Career high. I don't know. I think having made the decision to become an entrepreneur, it was like putting on a really comfortable coat. And you think, oh, I wish I'd had this coat earlier, right? I mean, I really, and again, my manager at Morgan saw that in me and said, you really should be an entrepreneur, Tabby. And I had never even considered that. I wasn't necessarily even sure what that was. So that was a high, making that bold move
Hmm.
and saying, and he was wonderful. He said, listen, if it doesn't work out, the door is always open here for you. But I think you should really make this move and think about it. So that was really a definite high because I think it was just, when we discover that alignment of fit, right? And the fit can be all sorts, so many different dimensions, passion, interests. It just felt so comfortable. And I thought, oh my word, that was a real high because there was an element of surprise because I hadn't even considered it, but it took somebody else's perception of me and kind of challenging me to think about that as an opportunity. So I think that was a very important moment.
Nice. Good. Sadly, for every high, there's also a low point. What's the lowest of the low points?
Yeah. I mean, my mother suffered some really significant health issues, and she was diagnosed with MS in her mid 50s, which was really devastating for the whole family. And I was trying to do my best to juggle. I was in high school at the time, and I think that moment made me realize how precious our lives are, right? And so lows have sometimes been health issues in the family, some personal health issues, right? Where you just have to say, okay, somehow my mother had this wonderful saying. She said, Tabby, don't forget, the fire truck eventually makes it to the fire. And that's something that I've always kept in my mind when I've hit a low. Um, but the lows are, I think sometimes, we've got a lot on our plates. And I often just say, wow, I hope I'm doing an effective job of juggling all my responsibilities to my family, to my friends, to my career, etc. And I'm not a big fan of that word balance because I think it kind of has a dictatorial, I mean, you're trying to calibrate. So I think the lows have occasionally been a sense of a little bit of doubt. I hope I'm doing a good job of balancing, but who assesses that, right? And I often felt as long as I feel I'm doing the best job I can, and that's important, right? But constantly being open to, okay, let me make some shifts here. I remember one client wanted me to do a major piece of work, and they gave me a number of dates. And I said, whoop, whoop, one date, that won't work, October 15th. And she said, well, okay, no problem. I said, it's my son's birthday. And I've never missed my children's birthday. So if we can possibly, and she said, you know what? I have rarely heard anyone so quickly say, no, that won't work because I have a family commitment, right? They might say, oh, they don't necessarily say it's a family commitment or they couch it in different terms. And it was very interesting because I, I was asked about work-life balance at this huge event. And I used that example and I said, I wasn't here on October 15th because I said that, I made a commitment from the get-go to my children that I will always be there for all of their birthdays. And a man in the audience got really emotional at that point. And I thought, oh no, I know what's happening here. Anyway, he came up to me after he said, Tabby, I'm so sorry. I just lost it. When you said with such conviction and such emotional honesty, I have never, he said, made any of my children's birthdays. And
Yeah, I
I
thought you were going to say that.
will never get that time back. I will, etc. So I think, we live in a world that puts so much emphasis on productivity and efficiency. And it's very easy to forget our human values and what our priorities are to the people that we love and care for. So I think sometimes the low is when I've had a level of self-doubt. Am I doing the best I can on that front? And ultimately, we're our own arbiters of that. And I've often, I occasionally ask my children, they say, "Are you kidding me? You would drop everything. I always knew that you were going to be appearing for the family events, the, birthdays, and so on." So they're both in their, one's in their mid-20s, the other's in his early 30s. So it's good to get that affirmation now because, you never know. Sometimes you have those dark nights of the soul and you hope, God, I hope I'm doing a decent job here because it's sometimes very, very complicated.
But I think it's a really important point, and it resonates so much with me from my military background because I mean I don't have kids, but I know a lot of my friends who have completely the opposite story to you. They've never been at home, or they've been at home for a tiny fraction of their children's birthdays, and actually some of the time when you do quite long deployments, at quite formative times, you're going away and you miss massive life moments, and that's obviously job dictated. It's not their individual fault. That's just the way the system worked. But it is really challenging in those kind of environments, and I think finding that any kind of balance is hard. I mean, I do tend to talk. It's interesting. My next question to you is actually going to be about balance, but I'll phrase it slightly differently since you said you don't like talking about that. But I tend to talk about quite a lot that it's work and personal, and it's a balance beam, and you do need to think about how you use one to help the other because they definitely can help the other, but you can't afford for them both to be out of balance. If you end up in that space, then you're in a much worse place because it's really hard at that point to keep yourself together. I think you've got nothing that's motivating you to keep going and rebuild and re-energize, and it's too easy in today's world. And actually, I think for a lot of young people, it's particularly challenging this. I mean, on one hand, the sort of Gen Zs of this world, I think, are quite challenging around work hours and wanting to be, they're quite pushy about why are you expecting me to do that? I have a life, I'm not going to do it. That's good, actually. On the other hand, I think a lot of organizations have an expectation that is very unreasonable in terms of what they're putting on people to do, and a lack of empathy and tolerance when they can't do it for whatever reason, and they are not being in any way generous of spirit with some of that. I mean that's not a universal truth. There are plenty that are exemplars, but I think there are some that I've seen and worked with that you think, ooh, that's not great.
Yes. And I think, the word that I prefer to balance is kind of integration, right? Work-life integration. How are you kind of moving the puzzle pieces so that, it kind of works? And it goes back a little bit to my point about situational leadership. I remember having a dinner in New York a number of years ago with a colleague of mine who was heading up a Fortune 500 company. And we were talking about this work-life issue. And she said, Tabi, I landed on a question that's been extremely helpful. And I've shared this with many, many people because I think it was really one of those gem moments, right? You remember these comments. She said, a couple of weeks ago, I had my board meeting and my 6-year-old was having her first violin concert. And I thought to myself, okay, I can reschedule this board meeting. And in 3 months from now, nobody's going to even remember. But if I miss this first violin concert, my daughter will always remember. So she said, the question I realize I should be asking myself, Tabi, is who will remember? And so she went to that concert, and her daughter's now in her late 20s. And she said she still remembers that moment because she didn't think I would be there.
Yeah, it's very special.
It's a really good question. And I share that all the time. Who will remember? Because it goes back to having a slightly longer runway perspective on your career, right? Sometimes these issues and decisions that we make take on grandiose proportions because we're consumed by the stresses, et cetera. But if we try to add kind of some longevity and look at our careers, as a journey, as you said earlier, and there are going to be speed bumps, there are going to be potholes, there are going to be all sorts of things that will be obstacles to that journey. But net, looking at it as a longer term journey, I think that question inserts some integrity into, or at least a kind of a true north in our compass that allows us to say, you know, I think I'm going to make this concert, right? And the irony is that she shared it with her board, and the board was so delighted that she rescheduled, right? So we have this worst case mindset that we sometimes apply to the decisions that we make to accommodate some of these personal priorities. So I think it's a really interesting point, because I just don't think things like this are formulaic. I think we really, as I tell people, you need to have those lines in the sand. You need to have come to some clarity about what you will not compromise and what you will, and just be clear about that. So in my case, one of the examples was my children's birthday. And that's why I was so quick with my comeback, because I, obviously know my children's birthday. So it was very, October 15th. No, it won't work. So I think that's that kind of process of self-reflection. It's a little bit of the manual of me. What is it? What are my values? What is non-negotiable? What am I prepared to be, perhaps compromise a little bit more? But I think having that nugget of some issues that are really preeminent in our value architecture is really important.
No, I really love the who will remember point, because I think that resonates again really strongly with me, not least because a number of the senior roles I've had in the past, I've always been very focused on the job and the kind of the impact you've had and leaving it better than you found it and all those things that we often talk about. And I have always said to people taking over from me in some of these quite big crunchy command roles and things like that, look, here's my number. If you need to call me, call me. I have never, ever had anybody call me. And the reality is, as you move, the world closes behind you. And, it's too easy to think I'm indispensable. If I don't do this, it will have catastrophic consequences. No, it won't. The reality is, it absolutely won't. It's very, very rare that that's going to be, anything more than a blip in the organization's kind of history if you're not careful. So I think it's important to remember that.
Mhm. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Talking of integration, then of your work and life, you obviously have a very full-on schedule. I'm just interested in what you do personally, sort of de-stressing, relaxing, clearing your mind, those kind of
Yeah.
things.
I mean, it's interesting because I find sometimes I love kind of the working very intensely, then taking a break. I have a dog, and I can see your dog in the background. My dog has really been wonderful because she has to be taken out, right? I mean, if I'm in the middle of the meeting, I might be able to find somebody, but walking my dog is really part of my daily cadence. And if I know that I need to travel or I have an arrangement which works out very well. But I think living in Switzerland, it's an occupational hazard to spend time in nature, and I do a lot of hiking. It's just wonderful. So I find spending time in nature, going on walks. I mean, I remember talking to a neuroscientist once, and I said, what is the easiest and best thing we can do for our brains, for brain health? He said, daydreaming. And I thought, how wonderful, and just because I do find that's what I do when I go on my walks. My mind is just kind of processing stuff. I have ideas, I reframe a project. And, so rather than sitting at my desk with on the computer and saying, okay, how will I strategize? I find that just a change of scenery. So I do quite a bit of physical exercise, swimming, hiking, walking the dog, bicycling. So I find that is wonderful because it's both stress releasing, and you're getting fresh air, and you just feel absolutely revitalized. So I don't see it as exercise. I really see it as just a shifting of gears and doing something entirely different. And yeah, just altering the pace of the day.
Yeah, I love it. It's a great example. As you say, one of my dogs sat in the background. I'm just pleased the other one's not sat on my lap because he's the same size as that one that's lying behind me. So, and he does think he's a
So
lap dog, which is
looks
not
like
really
he's
that.
very comfortable and
He-
having a
He's
snooze.
he is enjoying life there for sure. I always try with all my guests to tap into their own broader experience, not just the sort of personal leadership journey. I mean, you've got a huge amount of experience, not least through the current work you're doing with the Paradigm Forum, etc., and you lots of board roles. You've clearly got a very wide view on world affairs. It feels to me, at least, that we're entering a kind of very difficult time, geopolitically, climatically, all those sort of things, economically, socially. it's all playing into a space where it feels like the world is quite challenged. I'm just interested in what you're picking up, your perspectives on that kind of general, geopolitical challenge at the moment.
Mm. Well, it's certainly, the world's, situation at this point is definitely coming into a lot of discussions with clients, right? Because I think there's a lot of right now there's a lot of anxiety and stress about what if. And I ironically enough, I actually am very fond of that question, what if, because it goes back to my earlier point, can we begin to expand the considerations that we're factoring into our projects, into our thinking, and so forth. So, as much as these times I think are they've kind of gone beyond overwhelm, I do think that there seems, at least amongst the circles I'm traveling in right now, a real appetite to reflect on that, and to I find a lot of people are kind of reverting to deeper places, like what are my values, right? I mean, there's so much I can't control at the moment. So what am I doing about the things I can control? And am I addressing those with a kind of attention and thoughtfulness that is really important? Going back to my comment about some of my work with schools, I find that people are really looking at education from a very different vantage point right now, right? I mean, are we educating our future generation for you know, civic engagement, for a sense of citizenship? Is there a consciousness around the bigger we? And so I think there's a lot of concern that as we face seemingly insurmountable challenges, people do have a tendency, being the human beings that we are, to revert into these bubbles. Well, I can't control any of that mess, so I'm just going to live in my bubble and worry about my bubble. And I think what I'm seeing in educational institutions is a real desire, can we possibly shift that center of gravity so that we don't lose a consciousness, a level of consciousness and engagement with our bigger responsibilities, right? And I think that will be a real challenge, right? The whole notion of self-sacrifice, of, is there something I believe in that's much bigger than myself? Do I have a capacity and an appetite, the kind of the will and skill, right, to engage um, across differences, et cetera? So there's a real polarization right now in our society, and I think it takes a lot of energy and a lot of determination to I kind of overcome that resistance and ensure that we don't lose kind of that deeper foundational commitment to our values and so on. So, ironically enough, we're doing a huge project right now on humanizing technologists, right? And looking at what that entails, and how do we go about doing that and so on. So I'm gaining some solace from that. I feel as if, because we've kind of almost reached the end of one runway, people are saying, maybe we need to create different runways here, or we need to redefine what a runway is for, and so on. So we're almost going back to first principles, I find, in this case of some challenges and issues that I think we're going to have to face with a very different toolbox. And I think we're realizing that our toolbox is currently perhaps not equipped to deal with some of what we're dealing with. So the question is, how do we enhance that toolbox, and what will be required to do that effectively?
Really interesting. And I'm very interested in your comments about education as well, because I think one of my slight concerns, and there's a betraying interest here, I was a school governor of a major independent school until a couple of years ago. It's actually where I went to school. I did 8 years there, including being on the education committee of the board. Um, I do worry a little bit that certainly in the UK, I don't know whether it's true globally, our educational institutions are not really doing enough at the moment. And it's not a criticism per se, because I don't think they've got the tools to do it, to equip youngsters with a kind of preparedness for particularly AI and all that it's bringing, and the opportunities. It seems there's a lag cycle where the kind of industry commercial world has got to get its act together with this first and then feed that into the education process. I mean, simplistically, just things like exams. I mean, the reality is nowadays, obviously, where particularly where you're doing assessed coursework and so on, if you're using AI tools, you can generate very sophisticated answers to things that, if you're then putting those into exam papers, how on earth are they going to turn around and assess whether that's your work, unless you're turning around and saying, right, you've got to handwrite it, which most people would, that's a lost skill in itself, I think, for a lot of people. These are really big, difficult issues. And I think just preparing people in society for the fact that society is undoubtedly going to change very substantially as a result of not least AI. I mean, a number of other things as well, I'm sure, over the coming decades. But AI is going to reshape the world of work. I mean, no question about it. And that requires preparing people and preparing youngsters in particular for how do they make the best of themselves. And I just don't think we're in that space yet, are we?
Yes, no, we're not. And, I think that's one of the difficult, I mean, there's so many facets to this challenge. It's almost overwhelming. But, I even in the corporate sector, I see this kind of feeding frenzy of adaptation in the absence of a total strategy. It's almost like, okay, well, everybody's got this bot, everyone's got this. So these tools are coming in, but there's no understanding of the consequences, of the impact of that, nor is there any kind of prescient understanding of what are the questions that we should be asking in terms of the consequences of this. So it's this terror, and I was being semi-facetious before when I talked about the shelf life of knowledge, but when you look at AI, it literally is a matter of weeks. I mean, the pace of this change is so exceeds our capacity not only to digest the implications of that change, but to ready ourselves in any strategic or operational fashion to accommodate this. One of the things that we're looking at is even teacher preparation. I mean, it is so outdated, right? And so every element has to be really re-examined. And, kids as well. I mean, the irony is that kids between the ages of 6 and 8 are like sponges. You can have an incredible impact on very young kids if you give them the right tools at the right time. But the problem is that window starts to close as we get older, and our ability to be kind of nimble and agile in our thinking is severely compromised, right, over time. It's just the same thing with language acquisition. You can do a heck of a lot more with a 5-year-old in terms of learning a language than with a 25-year-old. So, our brains are constantly developing, but brain morphology slows down. So it concerns me because I don't think we understand truthfully have digested the level of urgency attached to some of these questions.
Yeah, just building on that just for a second. I mean, any advice you would offer to leaders as they enter the world of work, or indeed, current leaders who are climbing up that leadership ladder? Anything you would think about that in this space that they can do more of and help themselves and their teams?
Well, I think they have to become much more savvy with the research out there, right? I mean, in other words, there's a lot of work being done. I often advise companies that they should have their own think tanks, right? Because, so many people are so busy doing during the day that they simply don't have the bandwidth to stay up to date on the research and so on. So I think there's kind of a knowledge management component of this that I think a lot of people aren't taking seriously. And I think that's one area where the learning curve has to be significantly more compressed because we just don't have the luxury. So I think that there has to be almost kind of a brain hub within these companies that's really keeping pace with that research and that thinking. And by and large, that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's a great, very interesting point. And I totally agree with that. I think it's again, I often advise individuals, turn around and say, look, even if you're in the twilight of your working life, it's not too late for you to start getting engaged with this, and it's not good enough to just be led by other people on it. You need to be leading it, and you need to be getting in and using the tools and understanding what they can do and playing in that space. We're getting towards the end here, but I'm very conscious, having worked with you a number of times at Deloitte University, you have a large library of stories. You talked about your storytelling, and I would just be really interested in getting a couple of things from you that you've got stories that actually about your own life and things that have really shaped you, but stuff that I think would be helpful and would resonate to the listeners of this show about things that have happened to you that actually might be, wow, that's a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've mentioned this a few times, but I'm just so convinced that, your willingness and ability to talk to strangers is a really important skill these days, right? I mean, it goes back to my point about staying curious. There have been so many unanticipated conversations I've had with people in airports, et cetera, where I could have been looking at my phone and checking emails, but instead I was in line, had a conversation. And all of those moments of human encounter are potential stories, right? I mean, you never know what's going to occur, et cetera, et cetera. So and it's interesting because this whole approach or this notion was confirmed in a book that I read a few years ago called Consequential Strangers, and it was written by, I believe, two sociologists who said that, this is going to be challenging because of technology, where small talk is disappearing. And there was a book recently written, I believe, yeah, it was on tyranny, and he made a point in a podcast. The author, I think his name is Snyder, made a point that when we lose talk, we lose the glue of citizenship, right? And so we do become these atomized little creatures that are operating in our bubbles. But our desire and appetite to engage with one another without necessarily any agenda, right? I'm not talking about a transactional encounter, but in the spirit of relational outreach, it's just wonderful to just to engage people. And so again, we've had clients that have emerged from ad hoc conversations. We've had ideas for research that have emerged, and we don't go into that with that agenda. But it's one gap that I see. I see it at airports all the time. I mean, it's incredible. Nobody's talking to each other. It's really astonishing. So I think that's something just that thought I would leave with people. When was the last time I spoke to a stranger or just had a quick conversation or whatever? It's a wonderful way to grease the wheels, right? In terms of our capacity to kind of engage with life in a way that is not heavily agendaed and transactional and so on. And yet it can be enormously satisfying. And even in the capacity of just being helpful. I remember I was walking my dog a few months ago, and there was a woman who was obviously a little bit frail and trying to navigate these two bags. And I said, can I help you? And she said, no, no, that's all right. But thank you. Nobody ever offers to help anymore. And now, of course, every time I see her, she always says, oh, here comes the helper, right? And it was just a moment. And so it's just, things that are absolutely uncomplicated. I'm kind of stunned that the most basic human interaction isn't occurring, an offer of help or assistance or et cetera. It's
Yeah, very, very interesting. I've literally, the podcast that I released as we record this yesterday, the one that went out yesterday, is all about altruism, politeness, good behavior, and it's a personal thematic one that I do those as well as doing guest ones. And I totally agree with you. I think it's one of these things in society that sadly we are seeing diminish more and more, is just that willingness to just be nice to people, to hold doors open for people, to give seats up on trains, to speak nicely, to think about the language you're using, to do all those sorts of things. And amusingly, on your airports one, I mean, I was doing some work in Copenhagen earlier in the year, and I was on the flight back from Copenhagen, sat down on my seat. There was a lady in the window seat, the other side, was next to me, and so I just started chatting to her, as you do, and actually we had a great connection. We ended up the entire flight back to London. We were just chattering away, and I've subsequently done a podcast with her because she's an opera director. She's the artistic director at the Copenhagen Opera Festival and directs operas all over the world, and it was just that came from nothing, And I talk to people now, I use it as an example, I say this whole networking thing that some people are so afraid of, and they sort of think, oh, no, it's got to be, it's either too formulaic because it's in a forced environment, or it's just something I'm not comfortable doing. And so you really need to start getting comfortable with it. You need to be, if you're going to be successful at what you do, the world is built on relationships, particularly in non-transactional things. People are wanting relationships. They're going to buy from you because they like you, not because they're, of any other reason. If they don't like you, the likelihood of them buying from you, unless it's purely transactional, is very remote. It's so important. So no, it's a great story.
It is related to my earlier point about just staying curious. In any given day, you have the opportunity to learn, to hear another point of view, to have a laugh, etc. It is so interesting. I feel almost as if we're getting to a point where we're going to have a course on how to be a human being. And it's really
You never know.
fun,
Yeah, there's a
right?
market there for that, probably. The two questions I always ask my guests, Tabby, at the end. The first one is, what's the most memorable event, single most memorable event of your career so far?
Um, I mean, it was very memorable insofar as I was absolutely convinced I couldn't possibly do it. And that was running a public hearing with about 500 irate neighbors who were really upset about a sludge treatment plant that was going in, that was under construction. And my role was to act as the go-between between the architecture and engineering firm and this community. And I had, because I had studied some architecture, I could read the blueprints and so on. And I absolutely changed the design by translating all of this anger into some very concrete, specific proposals for the blueprint in terms of how they redesign it. And it really had an impact on the community. So I really love those moments in your career where you absolutely can see the before and the after. So I'm always seeking those before and after moments. So that would be one example where I felt I was really helpful to this community and addressed what was just a horrific stench that they were living with that was just completely unacceptable. So that was a very good.
Yeah, nice. I mean, it's always great when you get those incredibly satisfying outcomes, isn't it? Where particularly when they come from something you think, oh, I'm not sure I can do that at the start.
I
And
just, I've never dealt with 500 raging, angry people on the verge of throwing tomatoes and so on. I thought, geez, I've never done this before. Let's see, let's see
yeah,
how
what am I going to wear to this hearing that I don't care getting ruined?
I go.
Final question. What's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
Well, it's probably if I was, I don't necessarily remember what the question was, but I suspect I used the technique that I was told. That's a very interesting question, but I think the real question we need to ask ourselves. I actually don't, because I love questions, right? So I can't. I mean, I might have, I'm just trying to recall if there was a specific question, but I'm the kind of person that if somebody asks me a question and I find it really challenging, I'll probably say, you know what, that's really interesting. Let me get back to you on that. Because I will want to do justice to the question. So I'm not somebody who just throws out an answer for the sake of being done with it. So that would be, but I don't recall any specific question that was unnerving. Maybe it's because I just love questions. So maybe that's my problem.
No, that's great. That's a good answer to finish with. Tabby, you've been very generous with your time. It's been absolutely lovely talking to you. I knew it would be a great conversation, and so it has been. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Bob, and would be happy to do it again if you ever have any future questions and so on. It was
Oh, careful what you wish for. Thanks ever so much. Take care. I really hope you enjoyed this fabulous interview with Tabi Haller-Jorden. So many great insights to share, and I think such a useful set of stories and tips for leaders everywhere, and really great to have had the opportunity to talk to her. If you found it useful, please share it, please comment on it, please push it around your own networks to broaden the reach of this episode and the podcast more generally. So liking it, commenting on it, providing me with some feedback, all those things are immensely useful. If you found it really valuable to you personally and you're getting a lot out of what you hear on the podcast generally, please consider financially supporting the show. You could do that by going to the support the show link if you're listening to the audio podcast. That'll be in your platform, and you'll find that in the show notes. Or if you're on YouTube, then you can go to the link that's in the again in the notes, which is to patreon.com, www.patreon.com/leading4life. And there you'll find the option to sign up and support the show financially at 3 different levels. All of them are pretty cheap, and any one of them will make a big difference. So I'd be really, really grateful if you'll consider doing that. And just think about this as some sort of subscription that you're paying for some valuable advice, just as you'd buy a book or whatever else. So that would really help me. It helps me to keep the podcast going, and I'd be enormously grateful. But as I always say on these things, I'm just grateful for you listening anyway. So thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate that. And back again with another fabulous guest very soon. Speak soon. Thanks. Bye now.